Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your holding this hearing. I think it's an important hearing. Thank you, Secretary Harris. And thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. I'm glad you're here, Patty from Boston, and Kizzy, glad you're here too, and everyone who came for this important hearing. I also want to say thank you to the chairman again for all of your leadership on minimum wage. You've made something a national issue again that needs to be a national issue. Now, we're here today, I think, to focus on tipped workers, the waiters and waitresses who serve our meals, staff our hotels, wash our cars. Over 3 million Americans work such jobs that rely on tips. About 45% of those who rely on tips are over the age of 30, and over 70% are women, many with children. It's been more than 20 years since we increased the minimum wage for tipped workers, as you said. In fact, the minimum wage for tipped workers now sits at an absurdly low $2.13, which means that inflation has eaten it away, as you said, Secretary Harris. The minimum wage for tipped workers covered 50% of the minimum wage for other workers when it was enacted. It now covers only 29%. We can do better than that. So here's what I want to start with. What does the Department of Labor data tell us happened the last time we increased wages for tipped workers? Back in 1991, we hear the argument, oh, it's going to destroy jobs. What happened when we increased the minimum wage for tipped workers back in 1991?
I'm not sure we have data specifically about tipped workers, but the overwhelming weight of the evidence now, as I understand, I'm not an economist, but my understanding is the overwhelming weight of the evidence is that if you institute a moderate minimum wage increase, we don't see the kind of negative employment effects that Senator Alexander is talking about. And Professor Reich will have a lot more to say about this than I, because he is in the field. But there's been study after study after study comparing jurisdictions where the minimum wage has gone up and jurisdictions where the minimum wage has not gone up, and you don't see differential employment effects in those two jurisdictions. And Professor Reich co-authored one of those studies. Earlier today, Dr. Alan Kruger, who's the chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, talked about the evolution in the economics field and how the conclusion that he found back in 1995 has been validated time and time again, that we don't see a negative employment effect from increasing the wage.
So let me ask then about the current law on minimum wage for tipped workers. Right. As I understand the current law, someone goes out, they get their $2.13 on their paycheck, and if the tips don't bring them up to minimum wage, then it is the responsibility under federal law of the employer to fill in the difference, to make sure, in other words, that everyone reaches the federal minimum wage. The question I want to ask you is, how successful have you been at enforcing that?
We have a great deal of difficulty enforcing that for the obvious reasons, and that is counting the value of tips that are collected in a particular workplace on a particular night is an extremely difficult activity. And what tips are distributed, because they're often distributed in cash, is an extremely difficult activity. So the Wage and Hour Division, which has 1,000 inspectors to protect 140 million workers in more than 7 million workplaces, including the waiters and waitresses you're talking about, has a gravely difficult time trying to figure out who's gotten what and how much and whether it's from the right tip pool and who's been included. It's actually quite complicated. So it's very, very difficult to enforce.
So in other words, we don't have a lot of confidence that the federal law as it currently exists is enforced. I think what we've got right now is when you look at the poverty data, it turns out that workers who are employed as waiters and waitresses are nearly 3 times more likely to be below the poverty.
That's true. That's the only way to assure that these workers are going to get more money is to raise the cash wage the employer has to pay that goes on a pay stub that my investigators can check.
I also have been looking at the data about the impact of the minimum wage. As I understand it, what most of the studies show now is if we raise the minimum wage to $10.10, then we would generate about 140,000 new jobs. Mr. Shelton referred to this. I think we're reading the same studies. That would get about $32 billion more in economic activity. I know that Senator Alexander cares about generating more jobs and more economic activity. And as Senator Casey said, we affect 23 million children, and in particular, lift 17 million children out of poverty if their parents earned a higher minimum wage. which of course in turn reduces reliance on food stamps, Medicaid, earned income tax credit, and other forms of support. So it seems to me the only argument we ever hear not to do this is this argument that if we raise the minimum wage, there will be fewer jobs available. And I appreciate reading your studies, Dr. Reich. Also, Dr. Dubé from the University of Massachusetts Amherst was here before to talk to us about his studies. So I just want to think about this gold standard study. When you look at a metropolitan area that reaches across 2 states and the minimum wage goes up in one state, doesn't go up in the other, I would say that's probably the gold standard for testing whether or not there's going to be an impact on jobs from changing the minimum wage. So my question, Mr. Sherk, is are there any of those gold study standards that show that when that happens, that jobs have disappeared?
The question here, Senator, is what makes an appropriate control group, and that's at the heart of the dispute between Mr. Reich and his colleagues, and between Newmark and Washer and the research.
I'm sorry, Mr. Sherk, is there a study of the kind I just described?
So there are studies that control for local effects, that have local controls, and compare. They're not the cross-border studies. There are other studies.
Excuse me, let me just make sure I have this right. There are cross-border studies, is that right?
There are studies that compare the effects of states that raise minimum wage to those that do not, and include regional controls.
All right, and what do those studies show consistently?
The vast majority of these studies show that raising the minimum wage reduces employment. Now, what you have is...
Dr. Reich, is that right? You've got to turn your...
Yeah, they don't use regional controls. I'm sorry, you have to read the studies. I mean, not to cite the results, but there's no... They argue against having these controls, as you said in your own in your prepared statement. So now, once you get into local controls, you don't find negative effects.
What they include is state-specific trends for the...
That's just comparing one state to a random other state. It's not a local control. That's the whole point.
I was
that's
asking
what's wrong.
about a particular form of study, and that is you look at one metropolitan region that cuts across the state border. Minimum wage is raised on one side, not on the other, so you've got a consistent metropolitan region. I think that sounds like the gold study in determining whether or not a change in minimum wage affects whether or not there will be jobs. And as I understand it, Dr. Dubé's study, Dr. Reich's study, other studies have a consistent outcome. And what is it that is, Dr. Reich?
Well, first of all, let me just say, Aaron Dubé was a student of mine, and these are co-authored studies. So,
fair enough.
But we've now done this with 5 different data sets: the American Community Survey, the census, the what else do we use? The quarterly workforce indicators, the quarterly census of employment and wages, and we've used 5 different statistical approaches to having local controls, and they all come out the same way.
And that is?
That there's no negative employment effect.
All right. So I just want to say, my home state of Massachusetts has a higher minimum wage than the rest of the country. We're currently at $8, and we have a pending proposal in our state legislature to raise it to $11 an hour. I hope you will note that the Massachusetts economy is growing. Our unemployment rate is at 6.4%, more than a full point below the national average of 7.6%. I understand we need control studies. The control studies, it seems to me, reinforce the experience we have in Massachusetts. We have raised our minimum wage, we have stayed above the national minimum wage, and we have done better on employment. We have raised the boat, for all of our families, and it has worked for us. We have an opportunity here, it seems to me, Mr. Chairman, to generate jobs, to lift 17 million children out of poverty, to reduce the amount of money that we spend on Medicare, on Medicaid, on food stamps, on earned income tax credit. This is an opportunity for us. We need to raise the minimum wage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.